buck up, be a fucking man and read this, huh? There you go. Later that morning, recalled Erica Simon, the news spread in the most mysterious way that all those people who were walking about lost and helpless should assemble in the city park. Thus a grey mass of people began to move along in a line. One had ceased to be an individual and one was only part of a suffering mass. The grey line of people climbed over debris and over the dirt. One's feet stepped on burnt corpses and one didn't even think about it. As the stunned survivors assembled at the park and along the grassy banks of the Elbe, some found missing loved ones. Most, however, did not. As absorbed as they were with the hell all about, a few were aware of their own condition. When Margaret Frere asked for a mirror, she was staggered by what she saw. I did not recognize myself anymore. My face was a mass of blisters and so were my hands. My eyes were narrow slits and puffed up. My whole body was covered in little black pitted marks. Others suddenly realized that they themselves were seriously injured or that their hair and much of their clothing had been burned away. By noon, February 14th, a strange silence settled over what was once Dresden. The city was absolutely quiet, Gottsberganda remembered. The sound of the fires had died out. The rising smoke created a dirty gray pall which hung over the entire city. The wind had calmed, but a slight breeze was blowing westward away from us. And then, shattering the calm, came the sounds. I suddenly thought I could hear sirens again, continued Berganda, and sure enough, there they were. I shouted, and then by then we could already hear the distant whine of engines. The roar of engines grew louder and louder. As U.S. bombers began blasting the rubble to dust, American fighter planes zeroed in on the thousands of refugees at the park. Along the river and other open spaces, recalled Ada Marie Wyman. We looked up and saw how they flew lower and lower. They're coming here, we screamed. A few men took over and gave commands. Split up, scatter, run into the fields, down on your faces. While we were lying in the dirt, our hands clawing at the earth as if we wanted to crawl inside it, they came after us. Wave after wave, circling, flying low, shooting with their machine guns into the defensive people. Popping noises right and left. Clouds of earth flying up, screams. Like everyone else, I expected. I prayed, dear God, please protect me. A few seconds paused as the plane circled in order to come back at us again. The men screamed, up, run towards the trees. But again, that popping noise as they fire without mercy into the people, and screams and clouds of earth flying around. I took Hildy by the hand, and without turning around once, without even looking to see how many people, get up again, we ran. Panic broke out, says 15-year-old Gerhard Kuhnmund. Women and children were massacred with cannons and bombs. It was mass murder. While we literally clawed ourselves into the grass, I first just saw at least 5 American fighter bombers, which from an altitude of approximately 120 to 150 meters, opened fire with their cannon on masses of civilians. My companion was killed beside me in this attack. There was a hole in his back the size of a palm. Near the park, zookeeper Otto Sailor Jackson watched in stunned disbelief as one American pilot mowed down people running in the street. He attacked several times, flying very low, firing from cannon and machine guns into the refugees. Then he flew low over the zoo and made several firing runs at anything that he could see that was still alive. In this way, our last giraffe met her death. Many stags and other animals which we had managed to save became the victims of this hero. Although the raid lasted only 10 minutes, the Americans returned the next day, and the next, seemingly determined that not a single living thing should survive in Dresden. There seemed to be no end to the horror, said Ava Bayer. Desperate to prevent epidemics, the survivors of Dresden scurried between raids to dispose of the corpses. With thousands of bodies littered in the streets and parks, the task initially seemed simple. They had to pitchfork shriveled bodies onto trucks and wagons and cart them to shallow graves on the outskirts of the city. A British POW engaged in the cleanup observed. As the ghastly work continued, however, it soon became clear that in no way could such a slow process handle the enormous amount of bodies. Hence, huge grills were fashioned from girders in various parts of town, and corpses were stacked on them like logs. When the piles reached roughly 10 feet high and 30 feet wide, flamethrowers were used to ignite the mass. Elsewhere, workers simply built great mounds. Ava Bayer watched in horror as men poured gasoline over a large pile composed entirely of head, legs, and other body parts, Well, that mountain was ablaze. Trucks arrived and dumped more such loads. As the recovery continued and workers entered the ruins, even greater horrors were in store. Acting like vast ovens, superheated cellars had rendered their victims into liquid fat. Rescuers were walking up to their ankles in sludge, recounted Margaret Fryer. With his father, 10-year-old Thomas Weyersberg, entering the basement of his family's business to salvage from the ruins. In spite of the horror already experienced, neither father or son was prepared for what they found. We literally waded into the pit of hell, the boy said, carrying out fat-soaked documents, company books, stationery, even some typewriters. The walls were still warm when we progressed, wading ankle-deep in the fried human drippings. Despite Dresden's frenzied efforts to recover the dead, 10 days after the raids, mountains of bodies still awaited disposal for weeks. Workers with carts and trucks hauled thousands of corpses through the streets. Clearly, the dead in Dresden outnumbered the living. 1 month after the massacre, the Dresden chief of police reported that over 200,000 bodies had been recovered from the ruins. The official added that the toll might possibly reach 250,000. Later, the International Red Cross estimated that 275,000 had died in the raids. But they know now it was only 25,000 because they know these things now, right? In order to combat right-wing propaganda, that's why they did that, to find out the real number was only 25,000. Right? Who am I snarling at? Not you guys. Because of the incredible density of Dresden's population on the night of February 13th to the 14th, because thousands of victims were refugees with no records, because many bodies either lay buried forever in the ruins, or had simply melted like wax, other estimates that place the death toll at 300,000 to 400,000 may well be closer to the mark. Why not? At this point, after this. As news from Dresden spread slowly throughout the rest of the Reich, there was shock and horror, but mostly there was anguish. Dresden was a glorious city, wrote Ruth Andreas Friedrich in her diary. It is a little hard getting used to the idea that Dresden too no longer exists. I almost feel like crying. And Rudolf Semler, aide to the propaganda minister, also took note that the public facades of strength and courage could easily crumble in private. For the first time, I saw Goebbels lose control of himself when 2 days ago he was given the stark reports of the disaster in Dresden. The tears came into his eyes with grief and rage and shock. 20 minutes later, I saw him again. He was still crying and looked like a broken man. When words of the Dresden bombing first reached Great Britain, there was initial joy. That the 7th largest city in Germany should be scorched from the map was wondrous news, trumpeted by the British press. The hundreds of thousands of women and children should be burnt to cinders in the process was also an unexpected and fortunate bonus. Cabinet Minister Sir Archibald Sinclair heartily agreed with this attitude and lyrically termed the firestorm a crescendo of destruction. As more facts and information from neutral Swiss and Swedish sources began to arrive, however, many throughout the world were horrified. For the first time in the war, those in England, America, and elsewhere learned what Germans had known for 3 years, that the Allies were engaged in deliberate terror bombing. Angered and shamed by such a course when the war was clearly on its last leg, Richard Stokes lashed out in the House of Commons. What happened on the evening of 13th of February? There were 1 million people in Dresden, including 600,000 bombed-out evacuees and refugees from the east. When I hear the minister speak of this crescendo of destruction, I thought, what a magnificent expression for a cabinet minister of Great Britain at this stage of the war. Most outrage, high and low, was directed at Arthur Harris, Chief of Bomber Command. We were told at the briefing that there were many thousands of panzer troops in the streets of Dresden either going to or coming back from the Russian front, one angry RAF crewman later explained. My personal feeling is that if we had been told the truth at the briefing, some of us wouldn't have gone. To just fly over it without opposition felt like murder, added a comrade. I felt it was a cowardly war. Once known affectionately by many of his men as Bomber Harris. After Dresden, the air marshal earned a new nickname, Butcher. Butcher Harris didn't give a damn how many men he lost, as long as he was pounding the shit out of German civilians, growled one British airman. Meanwhile, the man directly responsible for the Dresden massacre began to publicly distance himself from both Harris and the terror bombing, Winston Churchill. It seems to me that the moment has come when the question of bombing of German cities simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. The destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. I feel the need for more precise concentration upon military objectives rather than on mere acts of terror and wanton destruction. Public pronouncements to the contrary, the air terror continued unabated. Lost almost entirely in the furor over Dresden was the February 23rd leveling of Pforzheim in western Germany. Although much smaller than Dresden, in 19 minutes the city was utterly destroyed, with nearly 20,000 dead. A short time later, the hospital city of Wurzburg was likewise incinerated. Additionally, in what appeared an attempt to broaden the war, American planes struck neutral Switzerland, raiding Schaffhausen in late February and striking Basel and Zurich on March 4th. Working in tandem with the bombing of German cities was the targets of opportunity policy on the countryside. Under this order, anything moving in the Reich was fair game for Allied fighter planes. Ships, trucks, cars, ambulances, bicyclists, farmers in fields, animals in pastures, even children in schoolyards provided potential targets. Steaming locomotives, which, my granduncles were those guys, were especially vulnerable as thousands including Olga Held, soon discovered. Suddenly, 4 American P-51 Mustangs swooped down on us at tremendous speed. 1 second they appeared right outside the train window, and in a blink disappeared with the roar. Minutes later, the Mustangs attacked from ahead of us, firing at the engine. "Olga, under the car!" Heiner cried out when the train came to a halt. We jumped to the ground, but before I could crawl under the car, the airplanes attacked again. This time they strafed the passenger cars. I heard the rat-a-tat-tat of bullets as they hit above me. Some of the passengers ran from the train across a field trying to reach a wooded area. One of the planes pursued them. None of the passengers made it. After the last plane rolled away, I was drenched with sweat and so weak I could hardly stand. Merciless attacks such as the above was a double blow to many victims. Unlike the British, American airmen had always been considered by most Germans, rightly or wrongly, as honorable, even chivalrous warriors. As one German explained, the Americans were regarded by us as soldiers. Their attacks were during the daytime and were nearly always directed at military targets, even if the civilian population sometimes suffered heavy casualties because of them. They flew in good visibility and risked the aim fire of our flak. Hence a certain respect for the armies, as we called them. After Dresden, however, and the targets of opportunity, Turkey shoot, most German civilians sadly saw little distinction between the British and American terror flyers. In response to the air war against Germany, Joseph Goebbels urged Hitler to abrogate the Geneva Convention, recorded Rudolf Semler. He said that this convention had lost all meaning when enemy pilots could kill 100,000 non-combatants in 2 hours. The convention made us helpless because it prohibited any reprisals on the enemy air crews while giving them the best possible cover for their terror attacks. By cutting loose from the convention, we would be able to condemn to death by summary trial all the British and American airmen in our hands on a charge of murdering civilians. That, said Goebbels, would stop the heavy air raids. Many Germans agree with Goebbels, and at the local level, some leaders already consider the Geneva Convention a dead letter. Read a decree from one outraged county official. The general public is to be informed that what enemy flyers are doing in the country has nothing whatsoever to do with the war. One must consider it plain murder when a woman with a white scarf around her head is working in the field, or a child is in the field and a flyer shoots and kills such persons. Therefore, I demand when enemy flyers are shot down and the pilots are able to rescue themselves, they are not to be captured alive. Though isolated instances of reprisal against downed Allied airmen did occur, such acts never became state policy. Indeed, despite the angry protests, Hitler and his military staff continued to abide by the Geneva Convention throughout the war. As a result, roughly 99% of Allied POWs survived to reach home. Even as the news of Dresden was reaching the rest of the Reich, a nurse in Vienna recorded in her diary on what was the typical fate of captured Allied airmen. Just as we were finishing, 2 American pilots who had been shot down yesterday morning were brought in. They arrived supported on either side by a German soldier. They seemed badly injured and could barely drag their feet. One had a burnt face that was quite black, with yellow hair standing up stiffly. By now we have about 30 American pilots in a hospital. They are treated well, but are taken down into our basement shelter only during the exceptionally heavy raids. One nurse brought one of them some flowers. I got one more.